So it is my pleasure to introduce, and I'm very glad she was able to accept our invitation, Alina Zare. She is a professor at the University of Florida. She was also an associate professor at the University of Florida. Before that, she was an assistant and associate professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia. She did a postdoctoral fellowship, or a research faculty fellowship, I'm sorry, at the Naval Surface Warfare Center. And I don't know that she'll be talking about her naval work, but she is a leader in that area. I know her from her leadership in the area of phenomics, which we've had a little bit of discussion on in the past in the seminar series, but that's using various tools to characterize plants, especially. And so she's been a leader at putting together the phenomics symposium, or what do you call it, annual conference, and using a lot of really cool AI and computer science tools to further the plant science community. And so that's why it made sense to have her talking in this weekly TAMU IDs seminar series. So I guess with that, we look forward to hearing about her one weird trick that she's going to tell us about. Just kidding. But Alina, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. And so I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk about some of our methods that we've been working on to get around or sort of alleviate challenges in labeling and limited data collection. Before I do that, I'll give sort of an overview of my lab and the work that we do, so you know me a bit better. If my slides will advance. So I run the Machine Learning and Sensing Lab here at UF, and this is an overview of our ongoing projects right now. And as Seth mentioned, we have quite a bit of work in plant phenotyping. So I'll talk about sort of those first. And that's going to be kind of the focus of the talk today, more or less. But we've been doing some work in plant root phenotyping. So imaging and characterizing roots in the soil through a number of mechanisms. And I'll talk about some of those. And also a lot of work in above ground plant phenotyping and crop stress detection. So we have a number of projects using a variety of sensors, from hyperspectral to LiDAR to thermal to image plants and detect and measure characteristics of interest about them. We have some work in forest ecology I'll mention today. And this bottom row, I'm not going to talk about it all in the talk, so I'll describe it a little bit if it's of interest, and you can reach out separately. But being an AI machine learning lab, we have to have some work in smart systems. So we have some ongoing work looking at smart power grids, trying to detect hacking or malicious behavior on power grids so that it can be mitigated without impacting people's service. We also have some work with NASA Langley looking at landing systems and uncertainty quantification. As Steph mentioned, I have a long history of doing defense work. And so actually before doing anything with plants or ecology, I was doing buried target detection. And I had a number of years working with the Army doing buried landmine detection. And because of that work, while I was at the University of Missouri, someone came up to me after a university sort of symposium and said, well, if you can find landmines underground, can you find roots? And that was really my introduction to plant science related work. But I still continue some work with the Navy, looking at automated scene understanding and mine countermeasures. And then we have some graph CNN-based work for a number of different projects, including looking at brain MRI scans and trying to identify if there's a relationship between people's spatial navigation ability and brain structure. Okay. So to get into the talk, a common or machine learning workflow that, and Seth mentioned that many of you are computer science focused, so perhaps this is well known to this group, but often in machine learning, you've got this common workflow in which you collect labeled training data, you pre-process or extract features from it, do some sort of data curation, then you select the model and you fit that model, right? And if you're hip, it's a deep learning model. And then in testing, you have some unlabeled test data, you extract those features, and then you can do prediction through your trained model, okay? And most of the time when we're at machine learning conferences and those circles, we're focused on the model and how to fit it. But the majority of the impact and the time is the data collection, labeling, and curation. And usually the amount of time you spend there to do a good job curating, labeling, and collecting your data tends to have a bigger payoff than the time spent tweaking or tuning a model, okay? And so this is where we've really, in my group, I've talked about a lot of the different application areas, but one thread that ties it all together is, can we address this data labeling challenge? Because even though it's essential, it's really challenging, okay? So it's often the largest bottleneck and impediment to performance, okay? And this is either not enough data, or not accurate enough, or high enough quality annotation. So I'll give some examples. Okay, so we have some work, I mentioned our work in plant root phenotyping. So we have some imagery from mini Rhizotron systems. So this is a diagram of a mini Rhizotron system. You've got these clear tubes that they insert into the soil, and then the plants grow around them, and you can stick a camera down it, take pictures all around, and you'll get images like what's shown here of the roots and the soil that just happen to be along the tube. And so we've collected, with collaborators, hundreds and thousands of these mini Rhizotron images. And one of the first goals is to be able to get some idea of, for example, root biomass by depth, or just how many root pixels there are along the length of a tube in different locations and plants. And so to do that, traditionally what people would do would hand trace these roots. And so this is incredibly tedious. There's some roots here that are really large and easy to see, but I don't know if it's coming through, but if you zoom in, there's really tiny roots, and they're hard to label. So you can imagine the amount of time it would take to slowly trace out each of these, okay? It's enormous amount of time, and we've done studies where we had the same technician relabel the same image, and they don't always agree with themselves, right? They'll miss roots sometimes that are hard to see, or across labelers, there's a lot of variance. So this is really tedious, really time consuming, and error prone because of that, the nature. And then oftentimes you're really data limited. So we've been doing some work looking at soil cores. So this is where people are going to the field or pulling out sort of a core, a cylinder of soil and roots from the ground, and then doing X-ray CT scans of them to get more three-dimensional architectures of those roots. And as I talked about the challenge of labeling those 2D root images, it's an order of magnitude more challenging with these 3D volumes of trying to delineate where the roots are. But then on top of that, we have much less data, right? It's a lot more intensive to collect this data and to image it. And so not only do we have all that tedious and error-prone labeling challenges, but we're also limited in the data quantity. And then sometimes labeling is just infeasible to do accurately. So this is some hyperspectral and LiDAR imagery we collected over the University of Southern Mississippi Gulf Park and many years ago. And this data is fully available if anybody wants co-registered hyperspectral and LiDAR. And we put several targets in the imagery. And so these red push pins on the Google Earth map are showing where we put targets. There were these cloth panels that we put on the ground. Okay, and the majority of those targets were sub-pixel. So the GSD of this imagery was 1 by 1 meter. And we had targets that ranged from a ½ meter on a side up to 3 meters on a side. So a lot of those targets were sub-pixel. And those that weren't sub-pixel were often under these trees. So you can see this tree canopy. These were beautiful live oaks. The targets were under them. And so essentially, because of the occlusion, they were also subpixel. And when you look at the imagery, it's really challenging, if not impossible, to see where the targets were. When we put the targets in the scene, I had a GPS unit. That GPS unit had a 5-meter accuracy. So we have no way of getting really precise ground truth here. To the best of our ability is we're able to say within a 5-meter halo, a target's located, okay? There's no way to go back and refine that because of the subpixel nature of the targets. And this happens quite a bit. We have some work in forest ecology trying to do tree species classification. And it's because of overlapping tree crowns, it's impossible to have a very precise outline of every tree canopy. Okay, so we have all these challenges with data labeling, and we know that they impact the downstream performance of most of our methods. So there's a lot of work in the machine learning literature and our group that's trying to address these challenges, right? But probably by far, the most common is just to ignore it and hope it works out, right? So this is, we'll often get, for example, poor quality labels, and we'll just train our deep net with those labels and say, well, maybe it's not so bad, okay? Or if we don't have enough data, perhaps we'll take a pre-trained model, fine tune it on the data we have, and perhaps it will work out. And a lot of the times it does, right? So maybe even, most of the time, there's no problem. But of course, sometimes that doesn't work out, just ignoring your labeling issues. And really it comes down to, and so I often get the question, well, when do you need to use a special approach? And it really just depends. Depends on the challenge of how challenging the problem is you're trying to solve. So the more challenging the problem, you tend to need more data and higher quality data. And when I say higher quality, I mean higher quality labels. So that you're often you can often get away with maybe slightly less data if you have really high quality labels, or get away with lower quality labels if you have a lot of data to overcome that, right? So there's all these trade-offs, and it just depends on the particular problem. But in the case where you don't have that right balance, we do need ways to address this. And there's a lot of approaches in the literature on these. And I'm going to talk about some of the examples from my group working in these. The most well-known is probably transfer learning. And it's so well-known, it's probably standard in the field right now. Okay, and so I'll quickly give an example of our work in transfer learning just to sort of set the stage. Essentially the idea is you often have a large, perhaps well-labeled data set that you've trained a model on, and then you want to transfer it to a data set where you have less data, okay? And so we did this with those mini Rhizotron images that I showed earlier. This work was led by my PhD student, Wei. And we had a unit architecture where the input was a mini Rhizotron image, and our output is just a black and white binary image with 1 where the roots are and 0 where there's not. And essentially to train this, like any deep learning architecture, you need a lot of training data. And we wanted to apply this to switchgrass mini Rhizotron roots. Well, if we had a pretty limited labeled switchgrass data set. If we train on it directly with the limited data set, we do poorly. But Diane Rowland's group, when she was here at UF, she's recently moved to the University of Maine. They gave us over 17,000 hand-labeled peanut root images, where someone went and hand traced every individual root. We were able to train this architecture and then fine-tune it on our switchgrass data. Okay, and so here's some examples of the peanut root mini Rhizotron imagery. This is the ground truth that was given to us by Diane Rowland's group, and this is the output of some of our units. So it does fairly well. And this is the data set that we had a large data set. But then when we wanted to apply it to switchgrass, we didn't have that level of labeled data. So we took that pre-trained architecture and fine-tuned it. And we can get good results on that peanut model, as opposed to what we're showing in the first row here if we just train on the switchgrass alone. And I think this is something that's been shown a lot in the machine learning literature now. Okay. So this is, a somewhat standard approach if you have very limited data, but generally you're assuming that the data labels you have for that limited data is of similar as good quality as your original data set used to train the architecture originally. Okay. And so we have the code available here, and you're welcome to give it a try. So I'm going to skip over curriculum learning. If you're interested in what we're doing there, I'd be happy to talk about it offline. But essentially, just to give the overview of curriculum learning, the idea is to show your machine learning model data in a sequence, right? You're providing it a curriculum from easy to more challenging is the idea. And there's a lot of strategies of how to figure out what's easy and what's hard and how you develop that curriculum. And there's a lot of cases in which that aids with the data labeling challenge. An area that we've had a lot of work in is weak learning. Okay, and with weak learning, the idea is you develop a machine learning model that has an objective function that explicitly addresses your form of data label imprecision or uncertainty. Okay, so when I started this, I said it's very common to take weak labels and just train your model as usual. And if that works out, great. And if not, this is when people will often pull out weak learning approaches that directly try to address this sort of uncertainty that you have in your labels. And there's many different forms of weak learning. What I'm going to talk about today is label imprecision. And specifically, in the past, this form of weak learning was called multiple instance learning. Okay. And so I'll introduce multiple instance learning. With standard classification, no weak labels. For every data sample, you'll have a label. So if we're trying to do root versus not root, where root is label 1 or red and not root is label 0, blue, you would take every pixel or every sample and you'd label it as target or not target, root or not root. Okay. With multiple instance learning, to sort of ease that burden, what we do is we label bags. We label sets of points. And we label it as a negative bag if none of the points have a target. And we label it as a positive bag if at least one point in the set is a target. So you can think of this as, for example, labeling on the image level. If you have a mini Rhizotron image and it doesn't contain any roots, you would label it as a negative example, negative bag. So you have this whole set of pixels, none of those are target. If you have a mini Rhizotron image where there are some roots and some not roots, and you don't know the ratio, you just know that there's at least one pixel of root in the image, you would label as a positive bag. And hopefully you can see that this really reduces the labeling challenge, right? So you don't have to go and hand trace each individual root. You're just labeling on the image level or the sub-image level saying contains root or does not contain root. This is an intuitive example I like to show to explain what multiple instance learning is. So for example, I've got these bags and I say each of these are positive bags, they contain target. And all of these are negative bags, they don't contain target. So you can quiz yourself what would be the target concept. And so this is conceptually how multiple instance learning methods work. What they say is what is common in all the bags with the target. So you do the set intersection, and this is common in all the bags that's different, not in any of the negative bags. So you'll take the set union and the difference of these two groups, and you'll end up with your target concept. So this is conceptually how multiple instance learning methods work. We'll have positive bags where we don't know on the sample level what's a target, what's not, but we know that there's at least one example. And we're going to try to find similarities across all those positive bags that's different from any of the negative bags. And my group has been doing multiple instance learning methods for quite a long time. It started out with hyperspectral and mixing, and we've sort of expanded it to other approaches or other application areas. I'm going to talk about two of those today. The first is our MIL-CAM method. that sort of extends this transfer learning for mini Rhizotron roots I mentioned before. Okay. And so this is when we developed it originally for mini Rhizotron root segmentation. And we wanted to be able to label the images much faster so we can get a lot more labeled data, right? So we're trying to play that balance of instead of having very high quality labels in which we're tracing out each root very carefully, what we did is we took the images, we divided them into large sub-images, and we went through and just said, yes, there contains roots, or no, there doesn't. So we're able to then generate very quickly a really large training set. It's just that large training set has these weak or imprecise labels. But the images that contain roots would be our positive examples. And we're saying there's at least one pixel in here that has root properties. And then the images that don't contain roots were our negative bag examples. And our first approach at this was, well, we had the UNet architecture that was working when we had individual samples, individually labeled samples where we had precise labels. We said, well, let's take that UNet that we knows work and add what we call the MIL layer, a multiple instance layer. And essentially what that was a large, global max for the positive bags and an average for the negative bags, where for the global max, we were saying if we have what's coming out of our UNet, there should be at least one pixel with a large value because it's associated with root. And for the negative images, we should take the average of the confidence of all the pixels for a negative image, and all of them should be low, should be small. And that should help us be able to train the network to separate out positive bags having at least one root image and negative bags having no root pixels at all. Okay, so this was our first approach. And it was so-so, okay? I'm not talking about MIAs today. It's another multiple instance learning approach. But I mentioned the UNet earlier. This was the ROC curve performance for UNet. So the x-axis is false positive rate, so number of background pixels incorrectly being called root, and the y-axis true positive rate. And so we have our UNet performance was up here, and the MIL UNet was down here. So it's not performing as well as our UNet architecture with really high precision labels, okay? But it was doing okay. And so here's some example results. These are the mini Rhizotron images, and here's this third column is the MIL UNet example outputs. And you can see it's missing a lot of pixels where it should be. So our second approach, and this is work that was all led by Gyohao Yu, was what we called the multiple instance learning class activation map approach. And so it was built off of these CAM approaches that have been in the machine deep learning literature. Okay, and so we train, so it's a network architecture that we train in 3 phases, and I'll walk through those phases. So the first phase is what's highlighted here. And we have the first half, that decoder phase of our UNet, and we train this to just be able to accurately say whether an image contains roots or not. And so this is the form of the labels we have, these weak labels of does an image contain roots or not. And presumably, if we can train this phase well with we're getting very high accuracy on train and validation data, presumably there's features being learned here that are indicative of roots, okay? And so after this first phase, what we do is then we take out feature maps from throughout the network. We do an interpolation where we upsample to the size of the original image. And then we come up with a clever way of subsampling that upsampled data. And our clever way was just making sure we span the color space. So we have, we take specifically the green channel because we just through testing, we found that that was very helpful in the root detection. And we just made sure we had sample points from dark to bright in that green channel. Okay, and we subsample those points, and we did a multiple instance style training on this, where we tried to classify each individual point as containing root or not. And the way we started originally is we just gave every point in an image the same label as the whole image. So if an image was negative, we said none of them were roots. And if an image was positive, we initially said that every pixel was roots. And then we iteratively refined that map by having some sort of automated thresholding and saying only points above the threshold are roots. And we do this, and this gives us an initial noisy, but initial estimate of a root map, okay, at the pixel level, using bootstrapping from only those image level labels. And then given this, we take that initial pixel map and we go back and we train our unit architecture. And we're able to train that unit architecture with these noisy pixel maps and get improved results, okay? And so this also goes back to that first thing I said at the start of the talk, is sometimes you just train a network with noisy labels and it does well, and we're sort of taking advantage of that here, okay? And so that second phase, we're training the pixel map and using the class activation maps as now labels for the unit training. And here's some example results. So here are some of the mini Rhizotron images. This is the output from NIL-CAM. And we've compared it to the class activation maps from a number of approaches in the literature, the original CAM paper, GradCAM, SmoothCAM, and so on. Okay. And then here's some comparisons to other multiple instance learning approaches. So one of the advantages of the approach is this weak labels. We said, well, would other weak learning approaches, multiple instance approaches, be able to do as well? And generally, for both the CAM approaches and the multiple instance learning approaches, MIL-CAM outperforms the other in everything except recall. But when you combine the two and you look at sort of F1 score and mean intersection over union, is so much better in precision that overall you get a boost in performance. So the next weak learning multiple instance approach I want to mention is our p-milled algorithm. Okay, and it's a bit different. So everything I've talked about so far has been deep learning focused. And when we started working in multiple instance learning, we were using sort of more traditional representative approaches. And I'll talk about that briefly. Okay, and this is work done by my former student, Sheng Zhou, who's now Dr. Zhou. And, you know, when he started looking at multiple instance learning, he went back into the literature. And originally, this field of work, what they would do is learn prototypes or a set of prototypes to represent the positive class. Or sometimes they would be margin-based and sort of do a discriminative approach to separate negative and positive samples apart. Okay, and I would call all the deep learning-based multiple instance learning approaches the sort of margin-based. And what Sheng wanted to do is say, I want to have some sort of generating distribution. I want to have some prototypes that represent my positive classes. But I know that my data has a lot of variability. So he was looking at hyperspectral imagery. So this is a Google Earth map of some of the area he was looking at where we had hyperspectral data. Okay, and so this is 2 areas of oak trees. Okay, so these were labeled polygons that's saying, okay, this is containing the same class. These are the same class, just 2 different areas. And what our data look like is shown here. So along the x-axis, we have wavelength, and the y-axis is reflectance, and each of these are hyperspectral responses at pixels in those areas. And you can see, although these are the same class, right, the same tree species, there's quite a bit of spectral variability. And so he said, well, I know I have weak labels because we're looking at this satellite and aerial imagery and drawing polygons that contain trees of interest, but also contains soil and other materials that we're not interested in. So these are certainly weak labels. But I want to be able to use these weak learning approaches, but be able to also, instead of just getting 1 or 2 prototypes, characterize the distribution, the variability of the spectral signatures. And so this is where the PMILD name comes from. It's probabilistic multiple instance learning with distributions. And he also added the case of where our labels, where we have positive and negative bags. And so the same thing is negative bags contain only negative examples, non-target, and positive bags contain some positive and some negative. He also added sort of probabilistic labels. So the probability that a positive bag is actually a positive bag. So he adds some flexibility in the labeling in that way. And then the goal is to take those and learn distributions that characterize the positive class. Okay. And so essentially he treated this like an expectation maximization algorithm. So we had a joint likelihood, log likelihood, where we said of all the points in a positive bag, for every positive bag and every point in every positive bag, we're going to assume it comes from this target distribution we're trying to learn. And we can have this target distribution be pretty flexible. Here he's showing just a Gaussian, but actually in his dissertation work, he extended this to be Gaussian mixture models. So it's highly flexible. And then for each sample, we have, of course, this hidden latent variable where we don't know whether it's actually a positive target point or not. Okay, so this is where the weak learning aspect comes in. For negative bags, we know it. It's the Zij for negative bags is 0. They're not a target point. But for positive bags, we don't know. And so we would use an EM approach, expectation maximization, where we have some probability that a particular point is a target. And based on estimating all these probabilities, we'll then update our class distribution estimates. And we alternate back and forth between updating our probabilities of whether we think a point is a target or not, and updating our target distributions, okay? And I won't go through all the math, but essentially this probability is where we build in sort of the information from the negative bags. And we compute, oops, hit too soon. We compute how likely, given our current estimate of the target distributions and background distributions, we estimate how likely each individual point is to belong to each class. And we use that to perform our E step in our expectation maximization method. Okay. And so here's just like a little toy example of his approach. It looks like a mess. It's purposefully supposed to look like a mess. But what we have in red are target samples, just randomly chosen from this 2-dimensional space. And each shape corresponds to a different positive bag. And then the blue points are, I said that backwards. The red points are our negative samples, and the blue points are our positive samples in those bags, where shape corresponds to bag and blue means target. And the pink curves is our initialization. So he said, well, I'm going to learn a Gaussian mixture model with 2 components to represent the target class. And his initialization, I think, is he ran k-means on the data set. So he clustered the data and set the mean and variance based on that split from k-means. And then given this initialization, he ran his EM approach that has this discriminative term to tell the positive and negative classes apart. And you can see this is what's learned, and it sort of shows how it converges, and it learns just those areas where there's only positive samples. So this is conceptually what the algorithm is doing in 2D space. You can extrapolate it out to high dimensions. We applied it to this hyperspectral data with many classes of doing tree species detection. Overall accuracy is on par with some of the approaches in the literature. We're not getting a big boost in performance on this particular data set, but I wanted to show these results because you see some interesting interpretations of the results. Okay, so going back to this this oak example. So we had these two areas of the same tree species. And this is showing our Google Earth imagery of these different polygons assigned the same class label. This is RGB, so the hyperspectral data is much lower resolution. So these are the RGB from the hyperspectral data. So you get an idea of how mixed these pixels are. But you also see sort of general color differences between the locations. And then on this right is our how likely we are to belong to the first Gaussian in our two Gaussian mixture, or the second. And you can see the green, more fuller oak trees belong to that first component, whereas these other brown, less sparse oak trees belong to the second component. So it's characterizing that spectral difference, okay? And you're able to kind of represent the data well. Here's some other examples. This is another tree species class. Again, we have these other polygons. He also ran it with a two-component Gaussian mixture for this class as well. And you see these differences where some polygons are for the first Gaussian and some polygons for the second Gaussian. But what we can see is you can take the results shown. The red and blue indicate first or second component. And you can see the variability is primarily coming from a different flight path. So the flight's carrying the camera, looping back over the imagery, and also characterizing different locations, so different polygons as you go across the scene. And so one of the nice things here is because it has this generating distribution, you can go and you can examine the mean, you can examine the covariance, and you can get a real explainable understanding of what is being learned. Okay. So just moving along to my next trick, we talked about weak learning. My lab's focused on that quite a bit. We've also done some work in self-supervised learning. And so this, I really think self-supervised learning is really interesting and sort of clever. The idea here is we want to not rely on any human labeled data and instead rely on some clever trick to generate labels for us for training. So our first sort of foray into this work, I'm going to talk about, it's not purely self-supervised, but it's almost there, okay? And this is work in, that we're calling deep forest. And so this is tree crown detection from NEON data. So NEON is the National Ecological Observatory Network, and they've got sites throughout the US where they're flying regularly hyperspectral LiDAR data and collecting a lot of measurements on the ground. And we took the high resolution RGB and LiDAR data from NEON. And we wanted to do tree crown detection or delineation. We've called it a lot of things, but essentially we want to identify each tree crown, and we're putting a bounding box around each tree crown. And so the way we've done this is there's many LiDAR-based tree crown detection approaches out there that have been developed in the literature. They're purely unsupervised and really focus more on canopy shape in the LiDAR data to detect the trees. And so what we've done is we apply that to our LiDAR data, co-register the LiDAR with the RGB, and use the detections from the LiDAR to put bounding boxes, very approximate, very noisy, lots of errors, but we do get a lot of detections on the RGB. The RGB is much higher resolution and is adding in features that are not in the LiDAR. So then we can train, given those noisy labels, I think we're applying ResNet 50 on the RGB imagery to do tree crown detection and placing a bounding box around it from the LiDAR images. So nowhere in this process did we go through and label the RGB imagery. We used purely those LiDAR outputs. We got good results. We did go through and hand label some RGB imagery, and we got better results. Okay, and so the results that we share are that self-supervised approach, and then a fine tuning with some hand labeled RGB. Okay, and you can see results here. This is from a comparison approach, and this is deep forest outputs. The comparison approach is our LiDAR-only pre-training algorithm, the output it's producing. And you can also go to idtrees.org, and you can explore the detections. So I think, if I'm correct, I think we have 180 million individual trees delineated. And thirdly, whenever I share this link, someone goes and they find the first error. So there's absolutely errors there, but we're really excited about the scale. Okay, and then the exciting thing was we didn't have to label it, really. Okay, and so the last type of approach is work in interactive learning. Okay. And so one thing with transfer learning and with weak learning is you still need to label some data, and it's often hard to know how much to label. Even I called the last approach self-supervised, but we did do some labeling of the RGB as well to boost the results. It's far fewer than if we had to label it directly, but it still needed some labeling. And so that really motivated our work in interactive learning, or human in the loop, to say we want to label as little as possible. So when do I know how much I've labeled is enough? How do I know when I can stop? And so this is bringing in active learning, interactive learning techniques to try and make that decision. Okay, and so this is work being led by my student Xiaolei Guo, and she's sort of crossing boundaries of looking at machine learning along with human-centered computing and human-computer interaction to figure out not only the best way to present data and interact with the data on a human-centered computing viewpoint, but also taking that interface and how it impacts the downstream machine learning. So a lot of the active and interactive machine learning papers out there assume a particular interaction. They say, assume we're providing bounding boxes, assume we're providing scribbles, these sorts of things. How can I develop an active or interactive learning mechanism? What Xiaolei is trying to do is put that whole stream together. What's the trade-offs between both the interaction to reduce human load, but also quality data for the machine learning. So this is one work of looking at those mini Rhizotron images where we have superpixel segments of just pointing positive and negative back, so using that weak learning. And so as we click and add positive and negative bags, the results update in real time, where you can then make a judgment call. Oh, this is good enough. I can stop labeling. I have one more example from her work. This is hyperspectral images of broccoli and other produce, and she wants to be able to segment the broccoli from the background. So she's drawing polygons. As soon as she gets the multiple classes on here, it trains a deep learning architecture to try and tell these apart. It's showing one image, but she's running it on a very large data set. And then based on these results, she can refine her labels or add labels to it. And once she's happy with the results, she can stop. And so she's looking at how do we do this from an interaction standpoint and also a visualization standpoint of what do I show the user to be able to get the best labels quickly. Okay. All right, so of course, there's many more tricks to address this data labeling challenge. I personally think that this is really an exciting area, and focusing on, how do we get those outputs we're interested in while really minimizing our amount of burden we have to do for labeling. Because once we can do that, then it start opening up applications of these techniques to all sorts of areas and individuals that may not be as familiar with them. So I do want to give credit to my group. So this is a just only slightly out of date image of the lab, and they, of course, do all the hard work. And I'd be happy to take any questions. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. If you guys want to put questions in the chat, any comments you might have or concerns. I gotta close my door here, excuse me. I've got a few questions to get us started while people are putting things in the chat. Also, you can feel free to unmute and go ahead and talk. So your self-supervised learning to me was really interesting. The way I understood it, it seems like you're using different data sources to sort of pull things out, right? And so you're using LiDAR to help pull things out from spectral. To what extent could you use, I mean, especially since it was hyperspectral data, could you use spectral data to pull out spectral data?
Yeah, I think so. The reason we went with that was primarily because we already had some tools to do tree crown detection on the LiDAR without requiring any labels, right? It was a purely unsupervised, just looking for sort of tree shapes. And that's what drove us to that. I think, you know, with the self-supervised work, is there a reasonable trick to get not perfect, but fairly good labels that you can then train a deep learning architecture with, right? So for us, it was, you know, there's a big spatial resolution difference between the LiDAR and the RGB, but we were getting good enough labels from the LiDAR that we could train that RGB, right? Bringing in the hyperspectral, I think, you know, we've thought about similar things of applying sort of the LiDAR data to the hyperspectral data. They're on much more similar spatial resolutions. And you get that sort of rich spectral data. I guess the question is, if you were to use spectral data also to do that, do you have that trick that gives you good enough labels that you can sort of overcome those errors, right? That's in them. I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but I do want to give another example from our work in self-supervised learning. So we have some work where we're getting overlapping images, right? So there's a lot of overlap from one image to the next. And we want to do sort of segmentation on those images as well. And we don't have labels per se, but what we do know is because the images are overlapping, we know those pixels that align belong to the same class. And so that's like another common trick in self-supervised approaches. If you know two things are the same, you can pull them together in your feature space and maybe have some sort of heuristic to tell what's different and push it apart. So that could certainly be the case with spectral data. If you have spectral data overlapping the same area, you can say, okay, just based on GPS, I know what's similar and I can pull those together in my feature space.
Yeah, I guess I was sort of just in that same direction. I was sort of thinking if you were using hyperspectral or RGB, it doesn't really matter, and using multiple bands to classify things, if eventually you would reach something that looks like a principal component classification, where you're pulling out multiple different things. You may not know what they are, but at least you'd be able to separate them pretty good. I mean, that's sort of what you're doing with the LiDAR to pull out the tree canopies, isn't it?
Right. Well, so I guess, yeah. So if you did sort of a PCA, you'd be able to say, well, I think these are different principal components. I think these belong to different things. And you'd be able to try and cue on that to pull things together if they should be similar or different if they're not. I think we're getting a little bit more information from the LiDAR because we know we're fairly confident that the things it's detecting as trees are trees, right? It's missing a lot of trees. It's missing the trees that don't have the really nice tree canopy shape. But we are able to say, oh, what's coming out of the LiDAR is very likely a tree. And so when we train our net on the RGB, we know we're training it to the class we're interested in. So if you had something just like a PCA, you won't know the class label. You'll just know whether they're similar or not. And so you'd have to have some way to kind of turn it into what's the tree, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If anybody wants to unmute, a question just popped up in the chat, but if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to.
Okay, so yeah, so I see a question in the chat about treating continuous responses like yield as categorical. And if there's a reason to do that. Well, you know, I think, so I think this does go back, and it's somewhat related to the idea that I mentioned in the talk about, you know, the challenge of a problem, right? So if you have a problem that's very easy, the classes are really easy to tell apart. You've got bright green trees and dark soil, and you're trying to tell them apart. You can get away with little data. You can get away with poor labels, and you can probably do a pretty good job. If you're trying to now predict something that is really challenging, you need better labels. You need more data to be able to do that. And I think it can be, that same concept could probably be extended to the question being asked. If you have something that's really clear, even though it's a continuous variable, it's really clear categories, right? Like low yield, high yield, you can tell them apart, right? There's a real clear binning of them. You could probably get away with categorical variables, and you can also probably get away with, lower quality data and do a good job. If it's something that's really challenging to be able to predict that yield, and there's a lot of overlap, and you need this sort of fine-grained response, you're going to need more data. You're going to need higher quality data, and then it's going to be really sensitive to how you label it, right? And so maybe moving away from continuous predicted outputs is a lot more challenging, because now it's going to be sensitive to how you bin it, how you categorize those results. Hopefully that answered. That's my take on it. That's by no means an exact answer.
So you got another question in the chat, but I think that comes to an argument I have with at least one of my students all the time, where they would like to bin their yield data, and I say, the statisticians tell you that you're always going to lose power by doing that, so that you're always better off treating a continuous variable as a continuous variable. And I think he believed that your presentation somewhat may show that classification may be a better approach for some of his data. So I think that's where that question came from.
Oh, well, only if it's really easy, right? Is my answer, right? If you need that, all that fine-grained information, binning it, you're definitely going to lose. Okay, so another question is, what would you expect would be the challenges you'd face with increased spectral resolution in general? So if we're talking about hyperspectral data and increasing spectral resolution, I think one of the common sort of problems there is just sort of standard cursive dimensionality issues, in which you have really highly correlated input variables, and making sure you are accounting for that effectively, right? So with really high, so, okay, I bring up cursive dimensionality, and right now we're like living in the land of the joys of dimensionality, right? We're working in deep learning systems that are projecting our data up into hundreds of thousands of dimensional space. And this, there's less of a curse, because the big assumption and the big thing we're relying on is that the data lies on some low dimensional manifold. So we can project to this really high dimensional space, but we don't have to characterize that full space. There's some manifold, there's some representation space, but the data lies in some subspace, and we really only need to characterize that. And I think that can be extended to the input space too, or hyperspectral data. We can have increased spectral resolution. You're adding in additional features, right? And so you say, okay, well, I've got more data. I've got more features. I need more data to characterize it. And that's absolutely true if those new dimensions are adding in unique information that you have to characterize. But if it's super correlated and it's just redundant information, you have to be aware of that and take tricks to mitigate it, but you don't necessarily need a whole bunch of more data. Most of the time when people are talking about increased dimensionality space, that's the first thing they jump to. I would think other challenges just with hyperspectral in general is really you get to those really narrow spectral bands, and understanding sort of the noise characteristics in all those bands and accounting for those appropriately. And so, where are your water bands, throwing those out, knowing your particular instrument, how does it behave across all these spectral wavelengths? Thank you for the question.
Other questions? I mean, I've got a list of like 7, so I'm happy to follow up, but I want to make sure especially the students who want to ask a question. And I don't know for the students, if you saw what I put in the chat, if you joined us a little late, you might not have, but the University of Florida, Dr. Zare said is hiring 100 new faculty AI position across all departments and campuses. And so, you know, might be a good opportunity to keep looking out that way. And if you saw what, you know, the very controversial man, Edward Snowden, tweeted out yesterday. So Edward Snowden is actually saying that if you're a university student, you should be pursuing agricultural science. And so Dr. Zare sort of getting to work with some of the agricultural scientists. We can use all of these types of tools. They really help, I think, a lot for some of these problems.
And I think for the students in computer science, it's the same thing as you. We often are really centered on, you know, technical skills, but to be able to develop these methods meaningfully and have some actual impact in the world, you have to get out of the computer lab, really understand what you're applying it to. And I think that's one of the exciting things of working in this area across agriculture and computer science. And just to plug UF with our 100 new hires, I think that interdisciplinary work is what's really exciting here on campus. It's because there's so many people doing applied work in so many different areas that you can take your computing skills into.
There's a follow-up question in the chat.
So the question is, we're using reflectance bands belonging to multiple time points during growth, okay, from drone imagery. And we're using them as predictors, but my concern is overfitting. Instead of using lasso, is there a better way to select variables to minimize the overfitting in our model? Yes. So there is, you know, any number of approaches to prevent overfitting, and that's probably the bulk of machine learning work right now. I think, you know, in addition to lasso and sort of more traditional regularizers, data augmentation and sort of ensemble training is another really popular sort of technique to prevent overfitting, right? So if you take your data set, you randomly split it multiple times, you train 100 predictors, often you get a boost of performance, right? And so you're less likely to overfit if you have this, you know, this random ensemble, right? The other thing is the data augmentation is one mechanism people are trying to do to prevent overfitting. The challenge there is your data augmentation has to be meaningful, right? And there still needs to be enough base data that you're not still overfitting where you're now just learning those small samples and all their permutations. So common augmentation techniques is just adding noise to the data, you know, changing orientation, flipping, rotating, these sorts of things. But people get very creative in the data augmentation realm. So for example, our work with sonar imagery, there's certain geometries we know are possible from the sonar data, just from the way the data is collected, certain physical constraints. So there's only certain types of data augmentation that we can take, but the noise of those systems are really well characterized. And so we can look at sort of the intersection of those geometric constraints and the noise profile and come up with really clever ways of augmenting the data. And that could probably be done with all data sets, right? So if you're collecting drone imagery, you know, if you're always collecting it around solar noon, the hyperspectral data, you know, there's going to be certain data you know you'll see and certain data you know you won't see. And you can use that to kind of get more realistic data, simulated data from your base data set. So that's what comes to mind as the most common sort of approaches to prevent overfitting. Certainly transfer learning that I mentioned, where you train on a really large data set and then fine tune in a sort of a limited scale on a smaller data set will help with that as well.
So we're about out of time, but you did have one clarification I want to make. I think on one of your early slides, you talked about quantifying uncertainty or identifying uncertainty. And then I don't recall you saying how what you were doing for that. I'm sort of wondering if interactive learning is part of the solution there, but can you talk about, unless I misunderstood you at the beginning, quantifying uncertainty and how you're doing that?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that. So one of the ways that we're doing that, and yeah, interactive learning can be, we haven't really thought about that as much. One of the ways we're doing that is we're trying to look at trained architectures, if we're talking about the deep learning space, and be able to say be able to have those architectures be able to say, I don't know, right? Be able to say when they have an input sample that is unlike data that they've seen in training. One way we've been doing that is by analyzing the null space. So what do I mean by that? So for every layer in a network, we're taking an input and we're multiplying it by a weight vector. Okay, so if you took linear algebra and you think back to your linear algebra, every time you do sort of a matrix multiply, you're projecting the data with that multiplication into the column space. And there's a portion of your sample that you're projecting that's then not being projected into that column space, it's projected into the null space, and it's essentially being ignored, right? It's you're mapping that component to 0. So what a neural network is doing is it's taking an input sample and it's propagating the things that are projected in the column space of those weight matrix, and every layer is throwing away some information that's being projected in the null space. And so it's just being completely ignored. And this can be very useful. So for example, if you're training a neural network to detect cats, for example, perhaps the color of the cat is, well, maybe that's not a great example, but let's just imagine that the color of the cat is not informative, right? You could have cats of any color, but what's really important is like sort of the texture and their shape. And so the color information is good to ignore, right? It's not providing a useful signal. If you kept it, you would overfit, right? And so we project the uninformative information into the null space. But also, a lot of times we're projecting useful information in that null space because we're sort of arbitrarily pick architectures, and we don't know the right dimensionality and these sorts of things. So what we've been doing is we've been taking the information, we've been looking at what's being projected into the null space and sort of characterizing the null space distribution on the training data. And then when we get a test point, we look at the data from a test point and we see, does it look like the training data in the null space? And if it's very different, then we say, this is something that perhaps we can't trust the network for. It just looks too different, right? So that's one way that we've been doing sort of uncertainty quantification, is how similar it is to taking every point and saying how similar is it to the training data, and then coming up with clever ways of trying to measure that similarity. One of those ways is by looking at the null space distribution, but there's other approaches that others have looked at as well. Yeah, so I mentioned it and I totally skipped over it. So good catch.
Well, we're well over time. I'm not used to having so many people still hanging on. I don't know if that's because they still want to get questions in or whatnot. Any final questions or comments? Or maybe they all went out to lunch or something. I think they do that sometimes with my class. It's all such interesting stuff.
Thank you. And feel free to shoot me an email if there's any further questions I can answer, or if you have any ideas that sparked from this, I'd love to talk more with y'all.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zare. Excellent job. Very interesting stuff. I think you made me think about some things I haven't thought about before, so I appreciate that. So,
all right, thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later.